it could be a substitute to money, to currency?
Yeah, definitely. And it already is. In many countries, people do use Bitcoin as money. Uh, and I think that it has all of the qualities of money. Um, it is depending on where you are, it is a generally accepted medium of exchange. All money has to be money is to be a generally accepted medium of exchange. And I think that basically when people choose to use Bitcoin, they choose to use it because they like its monetary qualities. It has a finite supply. It's not basically supply isn't governed by a central bank or something like that. And anybody can use it. Anybody who downloads the gets Bitcoin, on their phones, downloads a wallet, anybody can use it. And it's censorship resistant, right?
Esto es, La Inquietud con Garret Edwards, el lugar donde hay más preguntas que certezas.
Damos vuelta de página aquí en La Inquietud por CNN Radio Rosario. Tenemos un enorme honor, placer y privilegio. Nos acompaña desde los Estados Unidos de América, donde trabaja en AIER, en el American Institute for Economic Research. Trabaja allí desde el año 2020. Es el Managing Editor en esa prestigiosa institución. Previamente a eso, trabajó de manera asociada para el S&P Global Market Intelligence, es alguien que conoce mucho de los mercados y de las finanzas. Se ha graduado del Hampden-Sydney College, donde se recibió de economista y donde también estuvo como Senior Fellow en el Centro de Estudio para la Investigación de la Política Económica, trabajando también en el Departamento de Economía como asistente. Es también becario del Mercatus Center en la Universidad de George Mason en los Estados Unidos. Y tiene la deferencia de aterrarnos. Es David Waugh quien está del otro lado. Now I'm going to transition into English to say hello to him. David, how are you doing? Garret Edwards over here.
I'm great, Garrett. Thank you for having me. How are you doing?
Thank you for joining us, David. And I think you caught many of the words that I said in Spanish. I know that you have Chilean roots and Latin American roots in your family. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. Let's start with something that you've been researching a lot. And you've been researching a lot about Bitcoin, right? Which is, I think, a household name as of now. What can you tell us about Bitcoin, Bitcoin in 2022, Bitcoin and gold? Is that a thing?
Well, I think that the story of Bitcoin in 2022 has been one of weirdly kind of stability, right? Bitcoin, the price dropped down to the 20,000s, and it's been there for the past 6 months at least. And so actually recently Bitcoin has even been a little more stable than the US dollar, weirdly enough, and other fiat currencies because, obviously previously to 2022, Bitcoin was so volatile, right? And so the story of Bitcoin in 2022 is one of people just kind of buying it and holding it. And the price dropped significantly and it's kind of stayed there.
That's really interesting because you're talking about the volatility of the US dollar, David. And in Argentina, we are used to inflation. You already know that. Was the US unaccustomed to inflation, you think so?
I think so, definitely. I mean, in the US, right now, or over the past year, we've had 40-year highs in terms of inflation. And we really, citizens of the United States benefited from not experiencing that, levels of inflation that have hit other countries around the world. And one thing that's interesting to me about Argentina is not Bitcoin, but Tether and different stable coins
Oh, yes,
that
that's a
I've
thing here,
noticed.
yeah.
Yeah, it's an amazing innovation from what I can tell that allows people in countries like Argentina to have easy access to what's basically like a dollar equivalent that is not inflating at the same rates as their own national currencies.
That's such a big thing here, David, the one that you're mentioning. You're
Yeah.
probably in the know that we have over 40 different types of dollars here in Argentina, because we have the official rate, which you cannot get. We have
Yeah.
the Coldplay rate, the Coldplay dollar, because Coldplay is playing some concerts here in Argentina and they are getting their own dollar conversion. We have,
Oh, wow.
yeah, we do. We have crypto dollar, which is the one that you mentioned, which is one that many Argentinians, the one that are quite tech savvy, they follow. But I wanted to stay on the side of things of whether we understand or not how the economy works, because you were saying about inflation in the US. Do you think economic literacy in the US is good enough for people, for lay people, to understand what has been happening in the past couple of years?
Yeah, I think that it is an interesting phenomena that we've observed in the US is people becoming aware of the fact that it's most likely the central banks that are causing this inflation, right? And you see the memes of the money printer, right? People weren't aware of that, you know, prior to this, in the US at least, prior to this inflationary period. They weren't aware of the memes of Jerome Powell printing the dollars, right? And so I think that it's driving at least maybe not economic literacy, but definitely some awareness of the fact that when you print 40% of the money supply in 2 years, maybe that is what led to inflation rather than, what the politicians say, which is, various wars or supply shocks, which, you know, do have impacts on inflation to some extent, but are definitely, I can safely say, in my opinion, that they're not the main drivers of it.
Going back to Bitcoin and to other cryptocurrencies, David,
Hmm.
but maybe Bitcoin is the quintessential one. Do you
Yeah.
think it could be a substitute to money, to currency?
Yeah, definitely. And it already is. In many countries, people do use Bitcoin as money. And I think that it has all of the qualities of money. Um, it is depending on where you are, it is a generally accepted medium of exchange. All money has to be money is to be a generally accepted medium of exchange. And I think that basically when people choose to use Bitcoin, they choose to use it because they like its monetary qualities. It has a finite supply. It's not basically, supply isn't governed by a central bank or something like that. And anybody can use it. Anybody who downloads gets Bitcoin, on their phones, downloads a wallet, anybody can use it. And it's censorship resistant, right? And that's becoming really important to people, especially when their transactions are being censored by their banks, governments, etc. So right now, one of a big use of Bitcoin is by activists, and in other countries, human rights activists are using Bitcoin because if they're trying to you know fund their activism,
Yes.
their government might try to crack down on them, but they get around that by using Bitcoin. And as we enter into an era of increased financial repression, other people might start to value those qualities of Bitcoin, or maybe they'll see all of the harm that central banks are doing, and they'll that will draw them to Bitcoin.
We have some politicians in Argentina. I'm going to mention one of them because he's actually quite famous, Javier Milei,
Hmm.
that have been arguing for the past couple of years that central banks should not only be abolished but demolished as well. Would you agree that that's a solution to this problem, or is there another solution when it comes to the harm that central banks have been doing in many countries?
I think that in many cases, right, like in the US, one of the huge things that is deterring people from using Bitcoin is the fact that it's not legal tender. In the United States, you have to pay a capital gains tax on the gain or loss of your Bitcoin when you sell it or when you use it to buy something.
As if it were gold, for example, or a piece of art or
Yeah,
something. You have it, and it increases in value, but it's not the same way as with the US dollar.
yeah. So if we had the legal institutions that basically let Bitcoin compete on the same playing field as other, government currencies, then we don't need to abolish the government currencies to let people choose, basically, right? That's really what I think is a better solution, is just to let people choose what they want to use as money.
But I don't think the Federal Reserve wants that, right?
Uh, I I I don't think so. Well, you know, I can't speak to what the Federal Reserve thinks or wants. All we can do is interpret their actions. There are people that work at banks who that's their job, right? Um,
It is, it
so,
is.
but I think that I do think that alternative currencies do pose threats to central banks, especially with respect to the central bank's ability to conduct their monetary policy, right? Like one of the if all of the money in circulation was circulating on stable coins instead of in Federal Reserve member banks, then it would be a lot harder for the Fed to conduct open market operations. So I think that they do have an active interest in kind of keeping the money in their system.
People from all over the world, David, are closely following what's happening in the US. You're an economist, you
Yeah.
have an economist's mind. You don't have a crystal ball, but I guess that you try to anticipate what might happen in the upcoming months. How do you see the US economy going into 2023?
I think that on my, gut intuition, I see inflation remaining. I see, um, we had a recent GDP numbers came out that were actually not so bad. But I don't see significant rebounding economic growth anytime soon. I think that we've been kind of filling up the punch bucket with more punch every time instead of letting the party stop and letting people actually sober up. And I think that we'll see the repercussions of that for a while.
And on that front, how important do you think that the upcoming midterm elections are going to be when it comes to the US?
I think they'll be significant. It depends on basically if the Republican Party takes the House or the Senate, then they can really stop a lot of what President Biden's policies or a lot of President Biden's plans in his tracks. And we see this basically every US president, they get in there and then they try to do a lot of stuff and then their party loses the House or the Senate and it becomes kind of a stalemate. And I think that with respect to what the Biden administration has been trying to do, I think that this will have significant economic impacts because of the role that the federal government now plays in the American economy. You have the Biden administration with the Inflation Reduction Act imposing all sorts of rules and regulations on the energy industry. And I think that basically what we'll see is perhaps a slowdown of the push for more regulation and more antitrust and maybe a more business-friendly regulatory environment if the Republicans take the House and the Senate.
You mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act, and I could not help remember that Belarus passed an act to banish inflation. Actually, the consumer price index. If it were that easy to eliminate inflation, right, just with an act.
Yeah, if only it were that easy. I think it it speaks to I think it speaks to the citizenry how much rhetorical grift we allow our politicians to get away with. We really, I mean, he could have named it the $1 million for Everybody Act, and it's just a lot of it
Wouldn't that
because
be
it was
nice? Yeah.
yeah, because what was funny is the Inflation Reduction Act was all about energy policy and green kind of stuff. It had nothing really to do with inflation. So it was quite um, quite confusing to see.
David, we've been talking about Bitcoin, about money, about politics, about the Federal Reserve. In Argentina, we have this discussion. It's been going on for decades at least, where our central bank is not independent from the executive branch because the executive tells them what to do. Is the Federal Reserve independent in the US? Should something be done there?
I think that the answer to that depends on who you ask. I think that the Federal Reserve employees and the executive branch would tell you that the Fed is independent. But the Federal Reserve chair and other Federal Reserve kind of high level people that work there, they're politically appointed. They have to be, go through a Senate confirmation process. So they're privy to, or their jobs are basically dependent on satisfying political actors. And so they're not really this wholly independent agency that they would like to paint themselves as, but they don't, at least from what I can tell, they don't, directly take orders from the president. They're kind of more like a political body that exists alongside the president, but not so much this kind of independent, you know, independent political or independent bank that has the American people's best interests at heart, right? Like they'd like to think that they have.
Penultimate question, David. While we are none of us is wearing right now a tie, I know that you love them. I know that I love them. Is the old-fashioned tradition of wearing ties going away? Sadly, what do you think about that?
I think it would be sad if it fully disappeared. I think that ties are great. I think that the character Barney from How I Met Your Mother, a wonderful American show, really he really captures it. Sometimes you got to suit up, right? And I think I'll be honest, the only reason I'm not wearing a tie is because I kind of rushed to throw this on and just
I'm
didn't
not
have time.
complaining. I just
Yeah.
marked it because I know that you always wear ties, David. I know that you love them. I love them as well. And I wanted to at least dedicate a minute or so to that discussion because they seem to be going away. I mean, politicians use them less and less. You see them less and less on
Yeah.
TV. So and it's been happening in the West for at least the last decade.
Yeah. It's sad. Perhaps it's reflective of a more cultural shift in that maybe we're not taking ourselves as seriously anymore.
Do you think maybe that's what happened with hats when men used to wear hats?
Yeah, perhaps.
Maybe somebody said on the radio or on the newspaper, okay, so what happened to hats back then?
Yeah. Like the top hats that people used
Exactly,
to wear.
Those top hats. So David, we are arriving to the last question. This one I ask out of every interviewee because the show is called La Inquietud in Spanish. In Spanish it's a word game, it's a pun, but since we're doing this interview in English, I use an official translation, the one that I've chosen for this very end. What makes David Waugh restless?
Well, what makes me restless is financial regulation and kind of the discretionary regulatory state. You never know what's going to happen. And with innovations like Bitcoin and Tether that are allowing people to escape financial repression and creating real good in their lives, you never know what scheme a financial regulator could cook up to really make it extremely challenging for people to use those things, even though they're benefiting from them. And that kind of regulatory destruction of valuable innovations, especially in money, is something that I think we always have to be on guard for.
David, thank you for your time, for the time you share with our audience. We send you a big hug from Argentina.
Yeah, I love talking to you, Garret. This was awesome.
Lo teníamos a David Waugh desde los Estados Unidos de América, aquí en La Inquietud por CNN Radio Rosario.
Esto fue La Inquietud con Garret Edwards. Síguenos en redes sociales y en www.edwards.com.ar.